The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds of my empty house, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum where Margaret used to stand making her coffee. 3 months since the funeral, and I still set 2 cups on the counter before catching myself. The silence had weight now, not the comfortable quiet of a long marriage, but the hollow echo of rooms that remember laughter. I was washing my single breakfast plate when the gravel crunched in the driveway. Through the window, I watched my son David climb out of his new SUV, the kind with leather seats and monthly payments that exceeded my Social Security check. He moved with the confident stride of a man who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere, least of all in his father's house. But something was different today. Instead of his usual perfunctory knock and immediate entry, he remained on the front porch, hands deep in his jacket pockets. When I opened the door, his smile felt rehearsed. "Dad?" His voice carried that careful tone people use when delivering news they know you won't like. "We need to talk." I stepped back to let him enter, but he stayed planted on the welcome mat Margaret had bought at the farmer's market, the one with "blessing" stitched in faded blue thread. "This isn't your house anymore," he said, the words falling between us like stones into still water. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "What did you say?" "The papers you signed when Mom was sick." He pulled a manila folder from under his arm, the kind lawyers use for documents that change lives. "The power of attorney. We've been taking care of everything just like you asked." The kitchen clock ticked in the sudden silence. Margaret's African violets sat on the windowsill, their purple blooms defiant against the November gray. She'd tended those plants for 15 years, talking to them like old friends. "I signed those papers so you could help with the medical bills," I said slowly. "So you could handle things when your mother—" "And we did," David's tone sharpened. "But Dad, you're 73, living alone in this big house, all these bills, the maintenance. Jennifer and I have been talking with her financial advisor, and it just makes sense." Jennifer, my daughter-in-law, who smiled with her mouth but never her eyes, who'd spent Margaret's funeral reception discussing property values with her mother. Makes sense to who? David shifted weight from one foot to the other, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he'd been caught in a lie. "The house needs work, the roof, the plumbing. You can't handle all that anymore." I looked past him to the red oak in the front yard, the tree I'd planted the day we brought David home from the hospital 37 years ago. Its branches now stretched wide enough to shade half the lawn, roots deep enough to weather any storm. Where exactly am I supposed to go? There's a nice assisted living place in town. Jennifer found it. They have activities, meal service, people your own age. People my own age, as if I'd somehow become a different species, one that required specialized habitat. I stepped onto the porch, forcing David to move back. The November air bit through my flannel shirt, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. This was the porch where Margaret and I had sat on summer evenings, watching storms roll across the prairie sky, where we'd celebrated David's high school graduation, his college acceptance, his wedding announcement. "The lake house?" I said. "Is that still mine?" Something flickered across David's face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "Well, technically yes, but Dad, you never go up there anymore. It's just sitting empty most of the year." Not empty. Never empty. The lake house held 30 years of weekends, Margaret's laughter echoing across the water as she called for me to come see the sunset. Her reading chair still faced the window where she'd watched the seasons change. Her coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer, too precious to use and too painful to put away. "I'll need some time," I said. David's relief was visible. "Of course. Take all the time you need. A few weeks should be plenty to sort through your things." A few weeks, to dismantle a lifetime, to decide which memories were worth the space they'd occupy in a single room overlooking a parking lot. After he left, I walked through the house with new eyes. The kitchen where Margaret had taught David to make pancakes, his small hands sticky with syrup. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents, the tree always too big for the corner, but perfect for our joy. The garage where I'd shown him how to change oil, his questions coming faster than I could answer them. In our bedroom, my bedroom now, I pulled Margaret's jewelry box from the dresser. Inside, beneath her wedding ring and the pearl earrings I'd given her for our anniversary, lay a small brass key. I'd almost forgotten about it. The safety deposit box. Margaret had been methodical about important papers, organized to a fault. If there were copies of the documents I'd signed, if there were protections I'd forgotten about in the chaos of her final weeks, they'd be there. The bank was a 10-minute drive through downtown streets that had known me since boyhood. Mrs. Patterson at the front desk had worked there when I'd opened my first account 40 years ago. "Richard," she said, her voice gentle, "how are you managing?" "Taking it one day at a time." The standard response that meant nothing and everything. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd remembered, filled with the careful documentation of a life shared. Birth certificates, insurance policies, the deed to the house, the title to the lake house, and there, in Margaret's neat handwriting, a folder labeled "In Case of Emergency." Inside was a copy of the power of attorney I'd signed, but also something else. A letter in Margaret's careful script, dated just 2 weeks before she died. "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're probably feeling lost. I know how that feels because I've been lost without you many times over the years, even when we were in the same room. I'm worried about David. The boy we raised would never take advantage of your grief, but the man he's become. I see how Jennifer looks at our home, at the lake house. I see the calculations in her eyes. I've made some arrangements. The lake house deed is in both our names as joint tenants with right of survivorship. It passes directly to you, no matter what other papers you've signed. The house here is the same. David can have power of attorney over medical decisions and bill paying, but he cannot force you to sell or move unless you choose to. Be strong, my love. You taught our son to stand up for what's right. Now you may need to teach him again. All my love, Margaret." I read the letter 3 times, my hands trembling not from age, but from the weight of my wife's foresight. She'd known. Somehow she'd seen this coming and protected me the only way she could. The drive home took longer than usual. I stopped at the hardware store for new locks, at the office supply store for file folders, at the coffee shop where Margaret and I used to share sticky buns on Saturday mornings. Building time, gathering courage. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed David's SUV was gone, but there were fresh tire tracks in the gravel where another car had been parked. Jennifer's sedan, most likely, come to take inventory of what they thought would soon be theirs. Inside, everything appeared normal, but I knew better. My mail had been moved, just slightly. The papers on my desk were in a different order. Someone had been through my things with careful hands and practiced eyes. That evening, as I sat in Margaret's reading chair with her letter in my lap, I began to understand what she'd been trying to tell me. This wasn't just about property or money or where an old man should spend his remaining years. This was about dignity, about the difference between being helped and being managed, about whether I would face the sunset as the man Margaret had married or as the burden our son apparently thought I'd become. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the oak tree with white. I watched the flakes catch in the porch light and thought about the lake house, about the choice Margaret had given me, about the strength she'd always seen in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. Tomorrow, I would begin to set things right. Tonight, I would remember who I used to be before grief made me forget. I poured myself a finger of the whiskey David had given me for my birthday. Good whiskey, expensive whiskey, the kind that said he still cared about impressing me. But as I held the glass up to the light, I thought about Margaret's letter, about trust and betrayal, about gifts that came with invisible strings attached. I set the glass aside, untouched. From now on, I would be more careful about what I accepted from my son, and what I allowed him to take. The letter from the county assessor arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the usual bills and advertisements like a snake hiding in tall grass. Notice of property tax reassessment in bold letters across the top, followed by numbers that made my coffee grow cold in my hands. The assessed value had tripled overnight. Not gradually, as properties sometimes do in a rising market, but suddenly, dramatically, as if someone had whispered magic words into the right ears. At the bottom, in smaller print that required my reading glasses, assessment requested by current title holder for estate planning purposes. I called the assessor's office, my fingers steady on the rotary phone Margaret had refused to replace. "There must be some mistake," I told the clerk. "I didn't request any reassessment. Let me check, Mr. Hartwell." The sound of papers shuffling, computer keys clicking. "I show here the request came from David Hartwell. Are you related?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I was just beginning to smell. He's my son. Well, according to our records, he has legal authority to make such requests, power of attorney on file. After I hung up, I sat in Margaret's kitchen chair, my chair now, though it still felt like borrowing, and tried to piece together the implications. A higher assessment meant higher taxes. Taxes I'd struggle to pay on my fixed income. Taxes that would force me to sell or borrow against the house Margaret had loved, the home we'd built together, board by board, memory by memory. The phone rang at 11, David's voice bright and cheerful as morning television. "Dad, how are you doing? Jennifer and I were thinking we should have dinner together soon. It's been too long since we all sat down as a family." "Funny you should call," I said. "I just got some interesting mail from the county." A pause, brief but telling. "Oh, what kind of mail?" "Tax assessment. Seems someone requested a review of the property value." "Well, that's probably good news, right? If the house is worth more than we thought." "Is it good news, David?" Another pause, longer this time. In the background, I could hear Jennifer's voice, too low to make out words, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Dad, why don't we discuss this over dinner? Tonight, if you're free. Jennifer's making her famous pot roast." Jennifer's famous pot roast. Margaret had tried to be diplomatic about her daughter-in-law's cooking, but her diplomatic silences spoke volumes. "I suppose I could come by." "Great, 6 o'clock. And Dad, don't worry about the tax thing. We'll figure it out together." The house David and Jennifer had bought sat in one of those developments where every home looked like a variation on the same theme. Vinyl siding, 3-car garages, lawns maintained by services that arrived in trucks full of chemicals and good intentions. The kind of neighborhood Margaret and I had driven through on Sunday afternoons, marveling at how much money people spent to live so close together. Jennifer answered the door in an apron that had never seen actual cooking, her smile as perfectly arranged as the silk flowers in their foyer. "Richard, come in, come in. You look wonderful." I didn't look wonderful. I looked like a man who'd been sleeping poorly and eating worse, whose clothes hung looser than they had 3 months ago. But Jennifer had always preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. David emerged from what they called the family room, though I'd never seen much family happening there. He embraced me with the careful enthusiasm of a politician greeting voters, his hands patting my back in measured beats. "How's the old neighborhood?" he asked, guiding me toward their dining room table, a massive thing that could seat 12, but usually hosted only their own small trio. "Quiet. Mrs. Henderson next door brought me a casserole last week. Nice of her?" "That's sweet," Jennifer said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "Though you really shouldn't feel obligated to eat whatever people drop off. You never know about food safety when it's not prepared in a proper kitchen." Mrs. Henderson had been bringing casseroles to neighbors for 30 years. Her kitchen was cleaner than most hospital operating rooms. But I said nothing, just nodded and accepted the glass of wine Jennifer pressed into my hands. The pot roast was dry, the vegetables overcooked, the conversation stilted with the weight of things nobody wanted to say directly. We talked about the weather, about David's work, about anything except why I'd really been invited. It wasn't until Jennifer brought out dessert, store-bought pie dressed up on her good china, that the real purpose of the evening revealed itself. "Dad," David said, setting down his fork with deliberate care, "we've been thinking about your situation." "My situation?" "Living alone in that big house, all the upkeep, the expenses. The new tax assessment just proves what we've been saying. It's getting beyond what makes sense for one person." Jennifer leaned forward, her voice honeyed with false concern. "We found a lovely place, Richard. Sunset Manor. It's more of a community than a facility, really. Your own apartment, but with services, meals, housekeeping, activities." "I see. And the timing couldn't be better," David continued. "With the property values up, you could sell the house, pay off the capital gains, and still have enough left over for years at Sunset Manor. Maybe even leave something for the grandkids' college funds." The grandkids. David and Jennifer's 2 children, ages 8 and 10, who called me Grandpa Richard in the formal way children address strangers. Sweet kids, but distant, already being raised to see me as an obligation rather than a blessing. "What about the lake house?" I asked. David and Jennifer exchanged a look, quick but not quick enough. I'd seen that look before, usually right before David asked to borrow money. "Well, Jennifer said carefully. "The lake house is lovely, but it's so isolated. And the maintenance costs. You said yourself you haven't been up there since Margaret passed." "I haven't been ready." "Of course not," David said quickly. "But Dad, keeping it just for sentimental reasons when you could sell it and use the money for your care, isn't that more practical?" Practical. Margaret would have laughed at that word, coming from a son who'd bought a boat he couldn't afford and a house with payments that required both their incomes. "I'll think about it," I said. After dinner, as Jennifer loaded the dishwasher with military precision, David walked me to my truck. The November air was sharp with the promise of winter, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. "Dad, I know this is hard. Change is always hard, but we're family. We want what's best for you." I climbed into the cab of my old Ford, the seats worn smooth by 30 years of Saturday trips to the hardware store. What's best for me, or what's convenient for you? That's not fair, isn't it? I drove home through streets I'd known since boyhood, past the school where David had played Little League, past the church where Margaret and I had been married, past the cemetery where she now waited for me, with patient, eternal love. At home, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table with the documents I'd retrieved from the bank. Margaret's letter, the deeds, the real power of attorney that limited David's authority to medical and financial decisions, not property ownership. The house was mine, the lake house was mine. But David was applying pressure like a slow leak in a pipe, hoping I'd spring apart before I noticed the damage. I thought about the tax assessment, about the dinner conversation, about the careful way they had presented their solution to a problem they had helped create. This wasn't spontaneous concern for an aging father. This was a plan, executed with the kind of patience that spoke of long conversations and detailed preparations. My phone rang. David again. "Dad, I forgot to mention, Jennifer's brother works in real estate. He said he'd be happy to give you a market analysis on both properties. No obligation, just so you know what you're working with." "That's thoughtful," I said, though thoughtful wasn't the word that came to mind. "And one more thing, you know how much I love Mom, how much we both did? She'd want you to be practical about this. She'd want you to be safe and taken care of. Using Margaret against me. That was new territory, even for David. Your mother," I said slowly, "would want me to make my own decisions, like the adults we raised you to be." After he hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and listened to the house breathe around me, the familiar creaks and sighs of settling wood, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of wind through the oak tree's bare branches. This was more than financial manipulation. This was an attempt to erase me, to reduce me from Margaret's husband to David's burden, from a man with a history to an elderly problem requiring a tidy solution. But Margaret had seen it coming. She'd given me the tools to fight back, hidden in that safety deposit box like a gift waiting for the right moment to be opened. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making lists. Property lawyers in town, estate planning attorneys, the phone number for the county assessor's office, the documentation I'd need to prove I'd been manipulated into signing papers I hadn't fully understood. David thought he was dealing with a broken old man, someone grief had made compliant and weak. He had no idea that grief could also make a man clear-eyed about what mattered most. I would not be erased. I would not be managed. And I would not let him use Margaret's memory as a weapon against the man she'd loved. The clock on the wall chimed midnight as I finished my notes. Outside, the first serious snow of the season had begun to fall, coating the world in temporary white. By morning, the landscape would be transformed, familiar places made strange by winter's hand. But some things remained constant beneath the snow. The roots of the oak tree, the foundation of the house, the bedrock of a man's dignity when he finally decided to defend it. Tomorrow, I would begin to fight back. The law office of Marcus Henley occupied the second floor of a brick building that had witnessed more than its share of family disputes. I climbed the narrow stairs on a Thursday morning, my footsteps echoing in the hallway like a countdown to something I couldn't take back. Marcus had been Margaret's choice when we'd needed a lawyer for the house purchase 30 years ago. A careful man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of attorney who charged fair rates and slept well at night. When Margaret was dying, he'd helped us navigate the maze of medical directives and estate planning with gentle efficiency. "Richard," he said, rising from behind a desk that looked older than both of us. I was sorry to hear about the recent troubles. Margaret was a special woman. I settled into the leather chair across from him, the same chair where Margaret and I had sat to sign our wills. Marcus, I think my son is trying to steal my house. He leaned back, fingers steepled. That's a serious accusation. Tell me what's happened. I laid out the timeline. The power of attorney signed during Margaret's illness, the sudden tax reassessment, the pressure to sell and move to assisted living. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow pad. "Do you have copies of the documents you signed?" he asked. I pulled out the folder from the safety deposit box. Margaret's letter lay on top, and I watched Marcus read it twice before setting it aside with particular care. "Your wife was a wise woman," he said finally. "The power of attorney you signed is limited in scope. David can pay bills, handle medical decisions, manage your checking account, but he cannot sell property or force you to move. The house and lake house are still yours, free and clear." "Then why is he acting like he owns them?" Marcus pulled off his reading glasses and cleaned them slowly. "Because most people don't understand the difference between power of attorney and ownership. David may be confused about his legal authority, or..." He paused. "Or what?" "Or he's hoping you are." We spent the next hour reviewing documents. The original power of attorney was exactly as Margaret had said, limited, specific, designed to help without taking away fundamental rights. But tucked behind it was something else. A document I didn't remember signing, granting David broader authority over real estate decisions and asset management. My signature was there, shaky but recognizable. The notary's stamp was legitimate. But I had no memory of signing such a thing. "When would this have been signed?" Marcus asked. I studied the date, June 15th. The day before Margaret's final surgery, when the doctors had given us one last desperate option. I'd been in the hospital room for 18 hours, existing on coffee and terror. "David brought papers to the hospital," I said slowly. "Said they were insurance forms. I was so scared about Margaret, I just signed whatever he put in front of me." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This document would give him significant control over your property. But, Richard, there's something off about it." He pointed to a line of small print I'd missed. "This grants power of attorney over real estate, but only in the event of the principal's incapacity as determined by 2 licensed physicians. Have you been declared incapacitated?" "No." "Then this document has no current legal force. David is operating under authority he doesn't actually possess." The relief was dizzying, but it came with a bitter chaser of understanding. My son hadn't just misunderstood his legal position. He'd deliberately created a false one, counting on my ignorance and grief to make it stick. "What are my options?" I asked. Marcus leaned forward. "Several. First, we revoke both powers of attorney immediately. Second, we notify the county assessor that the tax reassessment was requested without proper authority. Third, we set up protections to prevent this from happening again." "What kind of protections?" "A revocable living trust. You transfer ownership of your properties to the trust, with yourself as trustee. You maintain complete control during your lifetime, but no one else can manipulate the assets. When you die, the trust distributes according to your wishes, bypassing probate entirely." We spent another hour discussing the mechanics. The trust would protect not just the properties, but my bank accounts, investments, even my truck. David would wake up one morning to find his assumed authority had vanished like morning frost. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as I prepared to leave. "If David has been misrepresenting his legal authority, that could constitute fraud. Do you want to pursue criminal charges?" I thought about the boy who'd helped me build a treehouse in the oak's lower branches, who'd cried when our dog died, who'd asked me to walk him down the aisle because he was too nervous to make it alone. That boy was still in there somewhere, buried under years of Jennifer's influence and his own weakness. "Not yet," I said, "but I want the option." That afternoon, I drove to the bank where Mrs. Patterson greeted me with the same gentle smile she'd worn since Carter was president. "How can I help you today, Richard?" "I need to close my checking account and open a new one. And I need David removed from all my accounts immediately." Her smile faltered. "Oh my, are you sure? That's a big change." "I'm sure." The process took longer than expected. David's name was on more accounts than I'd realized: savings, checking, even the certificate of deposit Margaret and I had started for retirement. He'd positioned himself as co-owner rather than just an authorized user, a distinction that suddenly seemed crucial. "We'll need his signature to remove him," Mrs. Patterson explained, "unless you have documentation showing revocation of his authority." I showed her the papers Marcus had prepared. Within an hour, David's access to my financial life had been severed as cleanly as a cut telephone wire. "Is there anything else you need, Richard?" she asked. "Yes, I want to know every time someone tries to access my accounts, every inquiry, every attempted transaction. Can you set up alerts?" She nodded, though her expression suggested she'd never handled a request quite like this before. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: control, not over David, not over the situation, but over my own choices. For the first time since Margaret's death, I was moving forward instead of being moved. The house felt different when I walked in. Still empty, still echoing with Margaret's absence, but no longer vulnerable. I was no longer vulnerable. I called my neighbor, Bob Henderson, who answered on the second ring. "Richard, how are you holding up?" "Better than I was. Bob, I need to ask you something. Have you seen anyone around my house when I wasn't home? Anyone who didn't belong?" A pause. "Well, now that you mention it, David's been by a few times. And that real estate fellow." "Real estate fellow?" "Young guy in a suit. Had one of those clipboards. Said he was doing an assessment for insurance purposes. Seemed legitimate, but he spent an awful long time measuring the outside of the house." My blood cooled. "When was this?" "Tuesday, I think. Maybe Wednesday. Time gets away from me since Helen passed." Tuesday was the day before our dinner conversation, before David had suggested his brother-in-law could provide a friendly market analysis. They'd already had the analysis. They'd been planning this move for weeks, maybe longer. "Bob, if you see anyone around my property again, anyone who isn't me, would you call the police?" "You bet I will. Richard, is everything all right?" "Getting there," I said. "Finally getting there." That evening I sat in Margaret's reading chair with the trust document spread across the coffee table. Each page represented a door being closed, a vulnerability being sealed. By tomorrow afternoon, David would discover that his assumed control had been an illusion all along. The phone rang at 9 o'clock, David's number on the caller ID. "Dad, I tried to transfer some money from your savings to cover the property tax bill, but the bank said there was a problem with the account." "No problem," I said. "I closed it." Silence. Then, "You closed it? Dad, how are you going to pay your bills? How are you going to manage your finances?" "The same way I managed them for 70 years before you decided I needed help." "This isn't like you. You're not thinking clearly. Maybe we should have Dr. Morrison take a look." "David." My voice carried the weight of 37 years of fatherhood, of discipline delivered fairly but firmly. "Do not presume to tell me how I'm thinking. Do not presume to manage my life, and do not ever again forge documents or misrepresent your legal authority." Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its concerned son warmth. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" "Nothing I can't prove. Marcus Henley has been very educational about the difference between limited power of attorney and what you've been claiming." The sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. David hadn't just been confused about his authority. He'd been counting on my confusion about it. "Dad, you're making a mistake. We're trying to help you." "No," I said quietly. "You're trying to help yourselves. There's a difference." After I hung up, I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the oak tree. In the porch light, its bare branches looked like arms raised in victory, or perhaps in blessing. Margaret had loved that tree, had insisted we build the house to accommodate its shade rather than cutting it down for convenience. Some things were worth protecting, worth fighting for. Some things endured not because they were easy to maintain, but because they mattered too much to let go. Tomorrow, I would sign the trust documents. Tomorrow, I would begin to build walls that couldn't be climbed or circumvented. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment to grieve, not just for Margaret, but for the son I thought I'd raised and the man he'd chosen to become instead. The Thanksgiving invitation came through Jennifer, delivered with the artificial sweetness of saccharin. "We'd love to have you join us, Richard. It's important that family stays together during the holidays." Family. The word had taken on new meaning since Marcus Henley had shown me the fraudulent documents. Since I'd discovered David had been measuring my house like a prospector evaluating a claim. I arrived at their subdivision at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine that had cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Margaret had taught me never to arrive empty-handed, even when the hosts made you feel unwelcome in your own life. The house smelled of turkey and ambition, every surface gleaming with the kind of cleanliness that required paid help. Jennifer greeted me at the door, wearing an apron that probably cost more than most people's entire Thanksgiving outfit. "Richard, you look wonderful. How have you been?" I looked tired, and we both knew it. The past 2 weeks had been spent in Marcus's office, signing papers, setting up protections, learning the legal vocabulary of family betrayal. But I smiled and handed her the wine. "Getting by, how can I help?" "Oh, you just relax. Everything's under control." Everything was under control. The table was set for 8, David and Jennifer, their 2 children, Jennifer's parents Gerald and Patricia Monroe, and me. 7 members of a coordinated unit, and 1 outsider who'd provided the resources for their coordination. Gerald Monroe had the handshake of a man who'd spent his career selling things people didn't need. His wife Patricia possessed the sharp-eyed efficiency of someone perpetually calculating advantage. They greeted me with the careful politeness reserved for elderly relatives who might still prove useful. "Richard," Gerald said, gripping my hand a beat too long. "David tells us you're thinking about downsizing. Smart move. Patricia and I did the same thing 5 years ago. Best decision we ever made." "I haven't decided anything yet." "Of course not," Patricia chimed in. "But when you do, we know some lovely places, much more suitable for someone in your situation." My situation. As if being a widower were a medical condition requiring specialized treatment. David emerged from the kitchen carrying a carving knife that caught the light like a promise. "Dad? Glad you could make it. How's the old neighborhood?" "Quiet. Mrs. Henderson brought me soup when I had that cold last week." "That's sweet," Jennifer said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "Though you really should be careful about accepting food from people. You never know about hygiene standards." Mrs. Henderson, who'd been bringing comfort food to neighbors for 40 years, whose kitchen was so clean you could perform surgery on her countertops. But I said nothing, just nodded and accepted the glass of wine Jennifer pressed into my hands. The dinner table stretched between us like a battlefield mapped in china and crystal. My place was set at the far end, beyond easy conversation, positioned like an afterthought. The children, my grandchildren, were seated between their parents, forming a small fortress of nuclear family solidarity. "Grandpa Richard," 8-year-old Emma said, "Daddy says you might move to a place with other grandpas." "Emma," David said quickly, "eat your turkey." But the damage was done. Even the children had been prepared for my displacement, taught to see it as a natural progression rather than an engineered exile. Gerald carved the conversation with the same precision David used on the turkey. Questions about my health, my finances, my ability to maintain the house. Each inquiry delivered with the bland concern of a man conducting a diagnosis. "The property taxes alone must be killing you," he said, accepting another helping of stuffing. "And with the new assessment, David mentioned it's gone up quite a bit." "It has." I kept my voice neutral, though I wanted to point out that the assessment had been requested by his son-in-law without my knowledge or consent. "Criminal, really," Patricia added. "The way they squeeze seniors on fixed incomes. Almost like they want to force people out of their homes." The irony was so thick you could have served it for dessert. After dinner, while Jennifer orchestrated the cleanup with military precision, David guided me to his study. The room smelled of leather and expensive whiskey, decorated with diplomas and awards that testified to his success in whatever it was he actually did for a living. I'd never been entirely clear on the details. "Dad, we need to discuss your banking situation." I settled into a chair that probably cost more than my truck. "What about it?" "Mrs. Patterson called, said you'd closed your accounts and opened new ones, without telling me." "I wasn't aware I needed your permission." David's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of his mother when she was trying to maintain patience with a particularly stubborn repair problem. "It's not about permission, it's about coordination. How am I supposed to help with your bills if I can't access your accounts?" "I've been paying my own bills for 70 years. I think I can manage a few more. Dad, his voice took on the carefully modulated tone people use with the mentally impaired. You're 73 years old. You just lost the most important person in your life. It's natural to feel overwhelmed, to make decisions that aren't entirely rational. Irrational, like refusing to hand over control of my life to a son who'd been planning my displacement since before his mother was cold in the ground. Marcus Henley found the documents very interesting, I said. David went very still. What documents? The ones you had me sign in the hospital, the ones that were supposed to be insurance forms but turned out to be an expansion of your power of attorney. A flush crept up David's neck, the same tell that had given him away when he'd been caught shoplifting candy as a teenager. Dad, you were upset, confused. The doctors said Mom might not make it through surgery. I was trying to protect you, to make sure you were covered if something happened. Covered or controlled. That's not fair. Isn't it? We stared at each other across the expensive desk, father and son separated by more than just furniture. I saw calculation in his eyes, the same look I'd noticed when he'd asked to borrow money for the house down payment, for the car, for the boat he'd bought and sold within 6 months. The trust is irrevocable, I said quietly. His face went pale. What trust? The one that now owns the house and the lake house. The one that protects my assets from anyone who might want to manipulate them. David's chair creaked as he leaned back. You can't do that. Those properties, they're supposed to be part of our inheritance. Emma and Tommy's college funds will be whatever I decide to leave them. If I decide to leave them anything at all. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. David's mouth opened and closed, searching for arguments that wouldn't come. Dad, this is insane. You're destroying our family over a misunderstanding? I'm protecting myself from people who think I'm too old and stupid to notice when I'm being robbed. I stood to leave, but David's voice stopped me at the door. What about Mom? What would she think about this? Using Margaret against me. Again. The second time in as many weeks. Your mother, I said without turning around, would be ashamed of what you've become. The drive home took longer than usual. I stopped at the cemetery where Margaret lay, under a simple granite stone we'd chosen together. The November wind cut through my jacket, carrying the scent of old leaves and coming snow. I kept my promise, I told her headstone. I used the protections you left me. A red-winged blackbird landed on the headstone and regarded me with one bright eye before flying away. Margaret had always believed birds carried messages from the other side. I chose to take this one as approval. At home, I found a package waiting on my front porch. No return address, just my name written in block letters I didn't recognize. Inside was a small digital camera, the kind used for home security, along with a note written in the same anonymous print. Thought you might want to see who's been visiting. I turned the camera over in my hands, examining it like evidence. Someone had been watching my house, documenting visitors I wasn't aware I'd had. The question was whether this anonymous helper was trying to protect me or frighten me. That evening, I called Marcus Henley's emergency number. Richard, what's wrong? I told him about the camera, about the note, about the growing sense that my quiet neighborhood had become something less peaceful. I'll have someone install a proper security system tomorrow, he said. Cameras, motion sensors, the works. If David or anyone else is monitoring your property, we'll have documentation. Is this what families do now? I asked. Spy on each other? Manipulate each other? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Some families. The ones that forget the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. After we hung up, I sat in Margaret's reading chair and tried to remember when my son had stopped being someone I could trust, when his concern had curdled into calculation, his love into leverage. The answer was probably gradual, the way rust spreads or foundations settle, invisible until the damage was too extensive to ignore. Outside, snow began to fall in large, lazy flakes that caught the porch light and danced before disappearing into darkness. Winter was coming early this year, and I found myself looking forward to it. Winter was a season of endurance, of making do with what you had stored up, of waiting out the storm with patience and prepared defenses. I was ready for winter, and I was ready for whatever David might try next. The security company arrived at 8 o'clock sharp on a Monday morning that smelled of snow and possibility. Two technicians in Navy uniforms who worked with the quiet efficiency of men who'd seen enough domestic disputes to keep their opinions to themselves. Motion sensors on all entry points, the older one explained, pointing to devices no bigger than smoke detectors. Cameras covering the driveway, front porch, and backyard. Everything feeds to this central hub, and you can monitor it from your phone or computer. I watch them work, threading wires through basement joists and mounting cameras with practiced precision. By noon, my house had become a fortress of documentation, every approach recorded and time-stamped. One more thing, the technician said, handing me a small remote. Panic button, press it, and it sends an immediate alert to the monitoring company and local police. Keep it with you. After they left, I sat in my kitchen and tested the system on my phone. The camera feeds were crystal clear, the motion alerts immediate. If anyone approached my property now, I'd know about it within seconds. Marcus Henley arrived that afternoon, carrying a briefcase that looked heavy with purpose. He spread documents across my dining room table like a general planning a campaign. "The trust is finalized," he said, pointing to a thick stack of papers. "As of this morning, you no longer own the house or lake house. The Richard Hartwell Revocable Living Trust owns them, with you as sole trustee." I signed where he indicated, each signature feeling like a lock being turned. What does this mean for David? It means he has no claim on the properties while you're alive, no ability to force a sale, no authority to make decisions about them. When you die, the trust distributes according to your wishes, bypassing probate entirely. And if I change my mind about who inherits what? Marcus smiled grimly. That's the beauty of a revocable trust. You can modify it any time. David's inheritance now depends entirely on his behavior. We moved through the remaining paperwork methodically. New bank accounts in the trust's name, updated insurance policies, a fresh will that superseded everything David thought he knew about my estate planning. "There's one more protection I'd recommend," Marcus said. "A charitable remainder trust for part of your assets. You donate property to a charity, but retain the right to live there for life. The charity gets the asset when you die, but no one can force you out or manipulate the property while you're alive." I thought about Margaret's favorite charity, the veterans organization where she'd volunteered every Tuesday until the cancer made it impossible. How much of the lake house value could I donate? All of it, if you want. You'd get a substantial tax deduction, plus the knowledge that David can never touch it. The idea had a certain poetic justice. David had been counting on inheriting the lake house to fund his lifestyle. Instead, it would go to men and women who'd served their country with honor. "Let's do it," Marcus made notes on his yellow pad. "I'll need a week to set up the paperwork, but Richard, once you sign this, there's no going back. The lake house will belong to the veterans organization upon your death." Good, Margaret would approve. That evening, my phone rang. David's number. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe I came on too strong. Maybe we both said things we didn't mean." I muted the television and gave him my full attention. "Go on." Jennifer and I talked it over. "We want to apologize. You're right. It's your life, your decisions. We were just worried about you being alone in that big house." The words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a play he'd practiced. "I appreciate that. So we were thinking, maybe instead of you moving somewhere else, we could move in with you, help with the upkeep, be there if you need anything. It would be like having family close again." I leaned back in Margaret's chair, processing this new strategy. When direct pressure failed, David was trying seduction. The same house he'd wanted to force me out of, he now wanted to move into. "That's an interesting idea," I said carefully. "We could convert the garage into a small apartment for Jennifer's parents. They're having some financial difficulties, and it would help everyone. One big family, all together. Gerald and Patricia Monroe living in my garage. The couple who'd spent Thanksgiving dinner explaining why I needed to be in assisted living. The irony was so complete, it felt like Margaret's ghost laughing in the background. "I'll think about it," I said. "Great. Don't think too long, though. The contractors Jennifer talked to said they could start work next week." Contractors. They'd already made plans, already begun the process of subdividing my home to accommodate their needs. The same way they'd planned the tax reassessment, the property evaluation, the gradual erosion of my independence. After I hung up, I walked through the house with new eyes. seeing it not as my sanctuary but as David saw it, a resource to be exploited, spaces to be redistributed, value to be extracted. Margaret's sewing room, where she'd spent winter evenings making quilts for church raffles. David would probably turn it into Jennifer's home office. The guest bedroom, where we'd hoped grandchildren might stay overnight, became Gerald and Patricia's retirement suite. The garage where I'd taught David to change oil would house the people who'd participated in planning my exile. I called Marcus Henley at home. "Richard, it's late. Is everything all right?" "David wants to move in with me. Bring Jennifer's parents, too. Convert the garage into an apartment." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Are you considering it?" "I'm considering how to stop it. The trust protects you. As trustee, you have complete control over who lives in the house. But, Richard, if they move in, it becomes much harder to remove them later. Tenants' rights, adverse possession claims, it gets complicated. Then I need to make sure they don't move in at all." The next morning, I drove to the lake house for the first time since Margaret's funeral. The hour-long drive through frost-covered farmland felt like a pilgrimage to a shrine I'd been afraid to visit. The house sat exactly as we'd left it, overlooking water that reflected the November sky like polished pewter. Margaret's reading chair still faced the window, where she'd watched storms roll across the lake. Her coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer, waiting for a morning that would never come. I opened windows to clear the stale air, started a fire in the fieldstone fireplace we'd built together, stone by stone. Then I sat in Margaret's chair and called David. "Dad, how are you? Have you thought about our offer?" "I have, and I've made some decisions." I could hear the excitement in his voice. "That's great. When can we start moving things?" "You misunderstand. I've decided to donate the lake house to the Veterans Organization. As of next week, it will belong to them." Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. "Dad, you can't do that. This place has been in our family for 30 years. It's been in my family. Now it's going to a family that served their country with honor. What about Emma and Tommy? What about their inheritance? What about it? You've spent the past month trying to force me into assisted living so you could sell everything I've worked for. Did you think I wouldn't notice? That's not... We never intended... You measured my house without permission. You requested a tax reassessment to create financial pressure. You forged documents to expand your legal authority. You planned contractors and conversions before asking if I wanted house guests. Each accusation landed like a physical blow. I could hear Jennifer's voice in the background, sharp and demanding, but I couldn't make out the words. "Dad, please, let's talk about this face to face. Don't make any final decisions until we can sit down together." We are sitting down together, right now, and I'm telling you that the lake house is gone. The charitable trust is irrevocable. What about the main house? Still mine. But, David, if you ever again try to manipulate my finances, forge my signature, or pressure me into decisions I don't want to make, you'll find yourself written out of that inheritance too. Another silence, shorter this time. When David spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of filial concern. "You're making a huge mistake. Family is supposed to stick together." "Family," I said quietly, "is supposed to protect each other, not exploit each other." I hung up and sat in the silence of the lake house, listening to the gentle lap of water against the dock. Through the window, I could see the tire swing I'd hung for David when he was 7, now weathered gray by decades of seasons. He'd been a sweet boy once, the kind who brought me dandelions and called them flowers, who'd cried when our dog died and asked if animals went to heaven, who'd wanted to be just like Dad when he grew up. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been replaced by a man who saw his father as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the pictures Margaret had taken during our last summer here. She'd been sick already, though we'd pretended otherwise. The photos showed her smiling determinedly, claiming territory against the cancer that was already claiming her. In one picture, David and Jennifer stood on the dock with their children, everyone grinning at the camera. But looking at it now, I could see what I'd missed then, the way David's eyes were focused not on the camera, but on the house behind us, calculating, measuring, planning. The lake house would go to the veterans. The main house would stay in my control until I decided otherwise. And David would learn that being family meant earning love, not inheriting it. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Dad, we need to talk." This isn't over. I deleted the message without responding. Some conversations were finished before they began. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the deck where Margaret and I had shared 30 years of summer evenings. Soon the lake would freeze, the house would sleep through another winter, and spring would come again to wake it. But this would be the last winter the lake house belonged to us. By spring, it would serve a new purpose, shelter new dreams, honor new memories. Margaret would approve. She'd always believed in paying forward the blessings we'd received. And she'd definitely approve of the look on David's face when he realized his inheritance had just evaporated like morning mist over the water. The meeting place was neutral ground, Rosie's Diner on the edge of town, where truckers and farmers sat alongside retired teachers and bank tellers, all united by coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and pie that tasted like someone's grandmother made it. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner booth that faced the door, and gave me clear sight lines to the parking lot. The manila envelope sat on the Formica table beside my coffee cup, thick with documents that would reshape the landscape of my family. Inside were copies of the trust paperwork, the charitable donation agreements, bank statements showing my new financial independence, and photographs from my security system, time-stamped images of David and Jennifer measuring my house, of strangers with clipboards evaluating my property like vultures circling carrion. Through the diner's plate glass window, I watched David's SUV pull into the parking lot. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, probably gathering courage or rehearsing arguments. Jennifer remained in the passenger seat, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. David entered alone, scanning the room until he spotted me. He moved with the careful precision of a man walking through a minefield, unsure which step might trigger an explosion. "Dad," he slid into the booth across from me, his smile strained. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Coffee?" Rosie herself appeared at our table, pot in hand, gray hair pinned back in a style that hadn't changed in 30 years. "Please." David accepted a cup with hands that trembled slightly. "And maybe some of that apple pie, if it's still warm." Rosie poured, her eyes flicking between us with the knowing look of someone who'd witnessed more than her share of family disputes. "Pie's fresh. Made it this morning." After she left, David wrapped his hands around his coffee mug like he was trying to absorb its warmth. "Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding." I opened the manila envelope and spread its contents across the table methodically. Bank statements, trust documents, security camera photos. Each paper placed with deliberate care, like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. David's eyes widened as he recognized the security photos, clear images of him and Jennifer circling my house with measuring tape, of the real estate assessor taking notes on his clipboard, of Jennifer's parents standing in my driveway as if they already owned it. "You've been watching us," he said. "I've been protecting myself. There's a difference." He picked up one of the photos, studying his own image with something approaching fascination. "Dad, this looks bad, but I can explain." "Can you explain this?" I slid a bank statement across the table, highlighting attempted electronic transfers that had been blocked by my new security protocols. 6 attempts to access my savings account, all from your computer. The color drained from David's face. "I was just trying to help with the tax bill. The tax bill you generated by requesting an unauthorized reassessment." I placed another document on the table. "Here's the county's response to my complaint. They're investigating how someone without legal authority managed to manipulate public records." David set down his coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "Dad, you're making this sound like some kind of conspiracy. We're family. Everything I've done has been to help you." "Help me what? Lose my home, my independence, my dignity? Help you face reality." His voice sharpened, revealing the frustration he'd been struggling to contain. "You're 73 years old. You live alone in a house that's too big for you, too expensive to maintain. You're isolated, probably depressed, certainly not thinking clearly about your future. My thinking seems clear enough to have outmaneuvered you." I placed the trust documents on the table, watching David's expression change as he scanned the legal language. "As of yesterday, I no longer own the house or the lake house. The Richard Hartwell Revocable Living Trust owns them, with me as sole trustee." "A trust?" David's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, do you understand what this means? It means you have no claim on my property, no authority to make decisions about it, no ability to force me to sell or move or accommodate anyone I don't want living there." David leaned back in the booth, his face cycling through emotions I'd seen before when he was younger, and his plans had collapsed around him. Disbelief, anger, calculation, desperate hope for a loophole he could exploit. "The lake house," he said finally. "What about the lake house?" I placed the charitable donation papers on top of the growing pile. "Donated to the Central Valley Veterans Organization, effective immediately. They'll use it as a retreat center for combat veterans dealing with PTSD. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft clink of coffee cups and the distant sizzle of bacon on Rosie's grill. David stared at the documents as if he could change their contents through sheer force of will. 30 years, he said. 30 years of family vacations, of memories, of you planning to sell it the moment I was gone. That's not true, isn't it? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a screenshot I'd printed from Jennifer's social media account. A photo of the lake house posted 2 weeks ago with the caption, "Can't wait to list this baby. Lakefront properties are selling for crazy money right now." David's face went ashen. Jennifer didn't mean, she was just excited about the market. "She was counting your inheritance before I was dead. They both were. Dad, please. Think about Emma and Tommy. Think about their college funds, their future." I am thinking about their future. I'm thinking about what kind of people they'll become if they learn that family means taking whatever you can get from whoever's too weak to stop you. David's composure finally cracked. "You're destroying our family over pride, over some twisted need to punish us for caring about you. I'm protecting myself from people who confused caring with controlling." Rosie appeared with David's pie, her timing impeccable. She set the plate down gently, refilled our coffee cups, and retreated with the discretion of someone who understood that some conversations needed privacy. David ignored the pie, his attention fixed on the documents spread between us. "What do you want from us? What do we have to do to fix this?" "Nothing. There's nothing to fix. The arrangements I've made are permanent." "Dad, be reasonable." "I've been reasonable for months. While you forged documents, manipulated tax assessments, and planned to convert my garage into housing for your in-laws. While you treated me like a burden to be managed instead of a father to be respected." David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I could see Jennifer's name on the screen. He declined the call. "She's worried," he said. "We both are. About you, about us, about what this means for the family." "The family?" I gathered the documents back into their envelope, each paper a small victory. "You mean the family that was going to warehouse me in assisted living while you sold everything Margaret and I worked for?" "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that." I stood, leaving money on the table for both our coffees and his untouched pie. "David, you can visit me when you're ready to treat me like your father instead of your problem, but you'll visit as a guest in my home, not as someone with claims on my property. And if we don't, if we can't accept these arrangements..." I paused at the edge of the booth, looking down at the son I'd raised to be better than this. "Then you'll discover that being written out of a will is surprisingly simple." David's face went white. "You wouldn't? I already have. The new will is very specific about who inherits what and under what conditions. Cross me again, and you'll find out how conditional those conditions really are." I walked toward the door, leaving David alone with his cold coffee and the wreckage of his assumptions. Through the window, I could see Jennifer pacing beside their SUV, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling her parents or a lawyer or anyone who might help them understand how their carefully constructed plan had collapsed so completely. Outside, the November air was sharp with the promise of winter. Snow clouds gathered on the horizon, like an army preparing for siege. But I felt warmer than I had in months, lighter, as if I'd been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there until it was gone. My phone buzzed as I reached my truck. A text from David. "This isn't over. We won't let you destroy yourself out of spite." I'd deleted the message without responding. Some battles were won not by fighting harder, but by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. At home, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, not the expensive bottle David had given me, which I'd poured down the sink weeks ago, but a modest brand that tasted like honesty. I sat in Margaret's reading chair and looked out at the oak tree where David had once built a treehouse with my help. back when he'd believed his father could fix anything. The security system chimed softly, alerting me that someone was approaching the house. I checked my phone, David's SUV in my driveway, all 4 occupants climbing out, with the grim determination of people who'd decided that reasonable discussion had failed. I smiled and took another sip of whiskey. Let them come. Let them pound on my door, demand entry, threaten legal action. They'd find out soon enough that all the doors they'd counted on walking through had been quietly, permanently locked from the inside. Some lessons took longer to learn than others, but David was about to get an education in the difference between authority and power, between inheritance and entitlement, between the son he'd been and the stranger he'd chosen to become. The pounding on my front door lasted exactly 7 minutes. I know because I timed it, sitting in Margaret's chair with my whiskey and watching the security feed on my phone. David led the assault with Jennifer close behind, her parents flanking them like reinforcements in a war they didn't understand they'd already lost. The smart doorbell recorded everything, David's increasingly desperate demands for entry, Jennifer's shrill voice insisting I was having some kind of breakdown, Gerald Monroe's authoritative pronouncement that I was clearly not competent to make these decisions, Patricia's suggestion that they should call someone in authority. I let them exhaust themselves against my silence. When they finally retreated to their SUV for what looked like a heated family conference, I opened my laptop and began transferring the security footage to Marcus Henley's email. Documentation of harassment, evidence of their belief that they could intimidate me into compliance. They left after an hour, tires spitting gravel in a display of impotent rage that reminded me of David's teenage tantrums when he didn't get his way. The house settled into quietude around me, but it was a different kind of silence than I'd known in the months since Margaret's death. Not the hollow echo of loss, but the profound peace of a man who'd reclaimed his own life. I spent the evening organizing papers, filing documents, creating copies of everything important. The trust paperwork went into the fireproof safe Margaret had insisted on after the Hendersons' house fire. The Veterans Organization donation certificates joined them, sealed in protective plastic like the precious things they were. The phone rang several times. David's number, Jennifer's, even one from Gerald Monroe that I found particularly amusing. I let them all go to voicemail, their messages growing progressively more frantic as the reality of their situation sank in. Dad, please call us back. We can work this out. Richard, this is Jennifer. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Mr. Hartwell, this is Gerald Monroe. As a fellow businessman, I think we should discuss this situation like reasonable men. I deleted each message without fully listening. Some conversations were finished before they began. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. Law firm letterhead, thick expensive paper, the kind of theatrical presentation that was supposed to intimidate elderly widowers into compliance. Marcus had warned me this might happen. Dear Mr. Hartwell, we represent David and Jennifer Hartwell in regard to concerns about your recent financial and legal decisions. Our clients believe you may have been unduly influenced, or may be experiencing diminished capacity. I read it once, then fed it into the paper shredder Margaret had used for junk mail. The mechanical grinding sound was deeply satisfying. Marcus called that afternoon. They're fishing, he said after I described the letter. Testing whether you'll fold under legal pressure. Do nothing. Don't respond. Don't acknowledge it. Let them waste their money on posturing. The second letter came a week later. Same law firm, more urgent language. Threats of court proceedings, demands for medical evaluations, ominous references to protecting vulnerable seniors from exploitation. This one joined its predecessor in the shredder. By December, the letters had stopped coming, but the surveillance had begun. Cars parked across the street for hours at a time. Jennifer's mother, walking her sister's dog, passed my house twice daily, though Patricia Monroe had never shown interest in exercise before. David himself driving slowly past at odd hours, sometimes stopping to stare at the house like a man studying a puzzle he couldn't solve. My security system documented everything: timestamps, license plates, facial recognition and software that Marcus had insisted on. A digital paper trail of harassment that would serve me well if legal proceedings ever became necessary. The holidays passed quietly. No invitations to family gatherings, no awkward gift exchanges, no pretense that we were anything other than what we'd become. strangers who happened to share a name and a history neither side wanted to acknowledge. I spent Christmas morning at the cemetery, placing fresh flowers on Margaret's grave and telling her about the veterans organization that now owned the lake house. She would have approved, I knew. She'd always believed in paying forward the blessings we'd received. They'll take good care of it, I told her headstone. Better than David would have. Snow began falling as I walked back to my truck, fat flakes that caught in the wind and danced before settling. Winter in its full glory, the season of endurance and patience and making do with what you had stored up. I was well stocked for winter. The call from Marcus came on New Year's Day, his voice carrying news I'd been expecting. "They're backing down," he said. "David's lawyer called this morning. They're withdrawing all threats of legal action." What changed their minds? Reality. The trust is ironclad, the donations are legally bulletproof, and their harassment campaign has been thoroughly documented. Plus, I may have mentioned that elder abuse is a federal crime with serious consequences. I smiled, thinking of David's face when he realized that intimidation only worked on people who were afraid. So it's over? The legal maneuvering is over. The family dynamics. That's up to you. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to imagine a path back to something resembling a normal relationship with my son. It would require admissions of guilt he'd never make, apologies for behavior he'd never acknowledge, changes to fundamental character traits that were probably too deeply rooted to alter. Some bridges once burned, left only smoke and memory. But that afternoon, as I was organizing Margaret's recipe box, I found something that changed my perspective. An envelope tucked between her card for apple pie and her famous Christmas cookies, my name written in her careful script. "For Richard, when the dust settles." Inside was a photograph I'd forgotten existed. David at age 5, helping me plant the oak tree in our front yard, his small hands dirty with soil, his face bright with the joy of creating something that would outlast us both. On the back, Margaret had written, "Some things take time to grow into what they're meant to be." I studied the photo for a long time, seeing not the manipulative man David had become, but the hopeful boy he'd been. People could change, I supposed, though it usually required consequences severe enough to shatter their assumptions about how the world worked. The letter I wrote that evening was brief, formal, but not unkind. "David, the legal matters have been resolved. The trust arrangements are permanent, and any attempts to challenge them will result in your complete disinheritance. However, if you wish to rebuild our relationship on terms of mutual respect, I'm willing to consider it. This would require acknowledging what you did wrong, making genuine amends, and demonstrating through actions, not words, that you understand the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. I will not be managed, manipulated, or treated as a burden, but I'm still your father, and the door remains open for the man you could choose to become. The choice is yours. Dad." I mailed it the next morning and waited. The response came 2 weeks later, not from David, but from Jennifer. A single sheet of expensive stationery, her handwriting as precise as her makeup. "Richard, David is too hurt to write this himself, but he asked me to tell you that your conditions are unreasonable. We were only trying to help, and if you can't see that, perhaps it's better that we maintain our distance. We've decided to focus on our own family and our own future. We hope you'll reconsider these harsh decisions before it's too late. Jennifer." I read it twice, then filed it with the other documents from this strange chapter of my life. Jennifer's letter was revealing in what it didn't say. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no genuine remorse, no understanding of why their behavior had been unacceptable. They'd learned nothing, changed nothing. They were the same people who'd tried to steal my home, just temporarily thwarted in their ambitions. That evening, I drove to the lake house for what I knew would be the last time as its owner. The veterans organization would take possession next month, but they'd graciously allowed me a final visit to collect personal items and say goodbye. The house felt different already, as if it knew its purpose was changing. I packed the few things that mattered: Margaret's coffee mug, the photo albums from 30 years of summers, the wind chimes she'd hung on the porch because she loved their music. Everything else would stay for the veterans. The furniture Margaret had chosen, the dishes we'd eaten from, the quilts she'd made during long winter evenings. They would serve new people now, comfort new stories, shelter new dreams. I sat on the dock as the sun set over water that reflected the sky like a mirror. Loons called from across the lake, their voices wild and free. Margaret had loved that sound, said it reminded her that some things remained wild and beautiful, no matter how much the world tried to tame them. As darkness fell, I locked the lake house door for the final time and drove home through familiar streets that looked different now, as if I were seeing them through new eyes, the eyes of a man who'd defended what mattered most and won. At home, I poured myself a glass of the good whiskey I'd been saving for a special occasion. This seemed special enough, the night I'd officially become a man who couldn't be moved against his will, who'd chosen dignity over family peace, and found the choice surprisingly easy to live with. The oak tree stood silhouetted against the stars, its bare branches reaching toward a sky that promised snow. Come spring, it would leaf out again, stronger for having weathered another winter. Some things endured not because they were protected from storms, but because they had learned to bend without breaking. I raised my glass to the tree, to Margaret's memory, to the strange path that had led me from grief to strength, from victim to victor. To weighted silence, I said aloud, though no one was there to hear. Some endings were really beginnings in disguise. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of restless energy that makes old decisions feel suddenly urgent. I was in my garden, planting the tomatoes Margaret had always insisted belonged in the back corner, where they'd catch the morning sun, when the car pulled into my driveway. Not David's SUV this time, but a modest sedan I didn't recognize. The woman who emerged was perhaps 40, with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. She wore a simple gray suit and carried a briefcase that looked well-used rather than impressive. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Sarah Chen from the Central Valley Veterans Organization. I hope I'm not interrupting." I brushed soil from my hands and stood, feeling the familiar protest in my knees that came with age and too many years of honest work. "Not at all. How can I help you?" "I wanted to thank you personally for the lake house donation, and to bring you some photos of what we've accomplished there." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick with pictures. The lake house I'd known, transformed. The living room where Margaret had read countless mystery novels now served as a group meeting space, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. The kitchen where we'd made breakfast for 30 years of summer mornings had been updated with commercial-grade equipment to feed retreats. But they'd kept the essence of the place. Margaret's wind chimes still hung on the porch. The tire swing I'd hung for David still swayed from the old oak by the water. The dock where Margaret and I had watched 1,000 sunsets remained exactly as we'd left it. "We've hosted 6 retreats so far," Sarah said, her voice warm with genuine appreciation. "Combat veterans mostly, men and women who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. For many of them, it's the first peaceful sleep they've had since coming home." I studied a photo of veterans sitting around the fire pit I'd built, their faces relaxed in ways that spoke of hard-won serenity. One young man, he couldn't have been more than 25, was teaching a little girl to skip stones across the water. His daughter, perhaps, finally getting to know a father who'd learned to be present instead of absent. "Your wife would be proud," Sarah said quietly. "The foundation she helped create is still growing." Foundation. I'd forgotten that Margaret had volunteered with their fundraising committee, spending Tuesday mornings stuffing envelopes and organizing bake sales with the methodical persistence she brought to everything she cared about. "She would," I agreed. "She always said the best gifts were the ones that kept giving after you were gone." Sarah hesitated, then pulled out another document. "There's something else. We'd like to name the retreat center after her, if you'd give permission, the Margaret Hartwell Center for Veterans Peace. We think it has a nice ring to it." The words hit me unexpectedly hard. Margaret's name living on, attached to something that mattered, something that would help people long after both of us were just memories. I had to clear my throat before I could answer. She'd like that very much. After Sarah left, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and tried to process the feeling that had been growing stronger each day. Not satisfaction exactly, though there was plenty of that. Something deeper. The sense that I'd not just protected what mattered, but transformed it into something larger than myself. The phone rang inside, but I let it go to the machine. Most calls these days were from telemarketers or well-meaning neighbors checking on the old widower down the street. I'd learned to distinguish between genuine concern and idle curiosity, and to respond accordingly. But when I checked the messages later, this one was different. "Dad, it's me." David's voice, smaller somehow than I remembered. I I drove by the lake house yesterday. Saw what they've done with it. It looks good. Really good. I thought you should know that. A pause, long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about respect, about family, about the kind of man I became without realizing it. Jennifer and I are getting divorced. It's been coming for a while, but your letter made me see some things I'd been avoiding. Another pause, shorter this time. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I know I lost that right. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to figure out how to be better, how to be the kind of person you and Mom raised me to be. I don't know if that's possible after everything I've done, but I'm trying. The message ended with the soft click of a phone being gently placed in its cradle, not slammed down in anger or frustration. It was the sound of a man who'd finally run out of demands to make. I played the message 3 times, listening not just to the words but to the tone underneath them, the careful cadence of someone who'd practiced what he wanted to say, the slight tremor that suggested genuine emotion rather than calculated manipulation, the absence of any request for forgiveness or reconciliation, just acknowledgement and, perhaps, the beginning of accountability. That evening, I drafted a response. Not a letter this time, but a brief note card, the kind Margaret had used for thank you notes and sympathy messages, plain white with my initials embossed in simple gold. David, change is possible at any age, but only if it comes from genuine recognition of what needs changing. I'm glad you're asking the right questions. Keep asking them. The door remains open, but only for the man you choose to become, not the man you've been. Dad. I mailed it the next morning and didn't expect a response. This wasn't about repairing our relationship. That would take years, if it was possible at all. This was about acknowledging that even the most damaged people could sometimes find their way back to decency, given enough motivation and honest self-reflection. A week later, I received an unexpected visitor. Emma, my 10-year-old granddaughter, standing on my porch with the serious expression children wear when they're on an important mission. Grandpa Richard, Mom said I could visit if you wanted me to. Behind her, idling in the driveway, was a car I didn't recognize. A woman sat behind the wheel, not Jennifer, but someone younger, with kind eyes and the patient posture of someone who understood that some conversations couldn't be rushed. I'd like that very much, I said, opening the door wider. Who's your friend? That's Sarah. She's Daddy's... Well, she's nice. She said she'd wait while we talked. I invited Emma in and made her a glass of lemonade from the mix Margaret had always kept for unexpected young visitors. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten alone for so many months, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence didn't feel empty. Daddy's different now, Emma said, swinging her legs from the chair that was still too tall for her. He says he made mistakes and hurt your feelings real bad. He cries sometimes when he thinks I'm not looking. Children see everything adults think they're hiding. Emma had been watching her father's transformation with the clear-eyed observation that comes before life teaches you to look away from uncomfortable truths. People make mistakes, I said carefully. The important thing is learning from them. He's been reading Grandma Margaret's old letters, the ones she wrote him when he was in college. He says he forgot what she taught him about being good to people, Margaret's letters. I'd forgotten she'd kept copies of her correspondence with David, filed away with the same methodical care she brought to everything. If David was reading them now, he was getting reacquainted with the moral compass she'd tried to install in him, the values that had somehow gotten buried under years of acquisition and ambition. What else has your daddy been doing? I asked. He got a smaller apartment. He says we don't need so much space for just the 2 of us. And he's been volunteering at the place where soldiers go when they're sad. Says it makes him feel useful. The Veterans Center. David was volunteering at the very organization that now owned the lake house. There was poetry in that, the kind of circular justice that Margaret would have called the universe setting things right. Emma and I spent an hour together, talking about school and books and whether I thought the oak tree in the front yard would be good for climbing when she got a little older. Normal grandfather-granddaughter conversation, the kind I'd been denied during the years when family visits had felt more like military inspections. When it was time for her to leave, she hugged me with the fierce affection children reserve for people they trust completely. Daddy says I can visit again if you want me to. Do you want me to? Very much, I said, and meant it. As they drove away, Emma waving from the back window, I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness. That would take much longer if it came at all. But possibility. The chance that some bridges, even badly burned ones, might someday be rebuilt with enough patience and genuine effort. That night, I called Marcus Henley. "Richard, everything all right?" "Better than all right. I want to make some modifications to the trust." "What kind of modifications?" I looked out at the oak tree, its new leaves bright green in the porch light. The kind that leave room for people to grow. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure about this? After everything that's happened?" "I'm not changing the fundamental protections," I said. "But I want to add provisions for partial restoration of inheritance, contingent on specific behavioral changes sustained over time. If David proves he's genuinely changed, genuinely learned from his mistakes, there should be a path back." That's unusually generous, given the circumstances. Margaret would have wanted it that way. She always believed people could choose to be better than they were. We spent an hour discussing the mechanics, behavioral benchmarks, time requirements, safeguards against manipulation or backsliding. By the end of the call, we'd outlined a framework that could reward genuine change while protecting against false reformation. The modified trust would remain my primary protection, but it would also become something else, a roadmap for redemption should David choose to follow it. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this place, from victim to victor, from bitter old man to someone who could offer hope even to those who'd betrayed him. Margaret's influence, I realized. Even in death, she was still teaching me about grace, about the difference between justice and mercy, about leaving room for the possibility that people could surprise you with their capacity for growth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to either build walls or leave doors unlocked. But tonight, for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like the man Margaret had married, strong enough to protect what mattered, wise enough to know when protection might become its own kind of prison. The oak tree swayed in the evening breeze, its branches reaching toward stars that had witnessed every season of its growth. Some things endured not because they were rigid, but because they knew when to bend. Yeah, I was learning to bend without breaking, to fight without destroying, to win without losing the best parts of myself in the process. It was, I thought, what Margaret would have called a good day's work. If you like the main character, type like.